So let's take a quick look at the mechanism. So it's very similar to the phosphohexose isomerase. So we're dealing with an enzyme that is able to extract the proton from one carbon and donate it back to another one. So depending on where you start, actually, if we start with dihydroxyacetone phosphate, the abstraction that is, let's say, more relevant here is from carbon number 1, and then the donation back will happen at carbon number 2 to convert the ketose into the aldose. If we wanted to formulate it starting with glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, we would have to look at the abstraction of a proton here from carbon number 2 and the donation back to carbon number 1. But otherwise, the mechanism is very similar to what we discussed for phosphohexose isomerase. So even the amino acid residues that participate here are analogous with the glutamate and the histidine residue. Okay, so what the end result of this lysis catalyzed by aldose is our 3-carbon sugars, as I said, and after the isomerization of dihydroxyacetone phosphate to glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, we have 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate depending on what reaction we are looking at, the aldolase reaction or the isomerization reaction. Here the carbons in our 3-carbon sugar stem from different carbons originally in glucose. Okay. So what happens now in the payoff phase, or the first step of the payoff phase? The glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is converted into a bisphosphorylated 3-carbon molecule 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. And here I think it makes sense to recapitulate functional groups a little bit, because we see that something happens here at carbon number 1, which in glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is our aldehyde carbon, and then we have converted it into something else. So what is this something else that we're looking at here, which carbon 1 is a part of? What functional group are we dealing with?
Phosphoester.
Who said phosphoester? Shame on you. It's a mixed anhydride. Okay. So why would it be a mixed anhydride and not a phosphoester?
Is it because of the...
Don't ask me, tell me. Rephrase your question into an answer.
Because the carbonyl carbon is connected to an aldehyde? No, alcohol.
So why is it a mixed anhydride? Who said that?
Because there's a phosphate group attached to the carboxylic acid, creating a carbonyl and a phosphate group flanking both the middle.
Okay, so what we're dealing with, phosphate derivative of a carboxylic acid. Okay, so what we have hidden here is a carboxylic acid, which is now linked to a phosphoric acid or the ionized form of phosphate. So we have 2 acids forming an anhydride, and here in particular a mixed anhydride. Okay? So what must have happened is that this aldehyde functionality got converted into the oxidation state of a carboxylic acid. So what is this? Oxidation, reduction. The title tells you. Look at the title. It's an oxidation. Okay, and you should remember that. Remember alcohol and aldehyde to carboxylic acid. Okay, remember those things because they will help you. It's not that I just want to use up the time I'm given here. I want to teach you something. So the aldehyde is oxidized to a carboxylic acid, but it's not a free carboxylic acid that we're looking at here. In this reaction, which is catalyzed by an oxidoreductase, which is also called dehydrogenase, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, the carboxylic acid is actually linked to a phosphate to form such a mixed anhydride. So, what red flag should go up immediately when we hear anhydride, mixed anhydride? You have to start thinking like a biochemist, guys. What did I tell you?
A high energy bond.
Yes, yes. Okay. So what this reaction accomplishes is the formation of an energy-rich compound. 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. It's energy-rich because we have formed energy. Are you recording? Because we have formed a mixed anhydride here. Okay. So how do we do that? We oxidize the aldehyde functionality in glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate to a carboxylic acid, but it's not a free carboxylic acid, but because we link it to a phosphate. So it's a redox reaction. So we do not have an isolated oxidation reaction of the aldehyde to the carboxylic acid. We also have to reduce something, and what is being reduced is a cofactor nicotine amide adenine dinucleotide, which is reduced to NADH. Okay, the reduced form of this cofactor. So let's take a look, and this is a reversible reaction. Okay, so let's take a look at the mechanism, and this is a classic textbook mechanism that biochemists love. So you better familiarize yourself with this mechanism because you can learn a lot of things when you take a look at this. So here again we have the active site of an enzyme, in particular here glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. We have actually another amino acid residue that will participate in some sort of acid-base catalysis. Therefore, we just abbreviated here with B, but I added that this is a histidine residue. We have an SH, a thiol group, which will probably come from what type of amino acid in the active site? Cysteine. Okay, where else would it come from? So we have a cysteine, a crucial cysteine residue in the active site, and this probably will be made a better nucleophile by abstracting a proton with the help of this histidine residue to form a thiolate anion. Thiolate anions are about the best nucleophiles you find in biochemistry. Okay, so this sulfur then will attack the aldehyde carbon here of our substrate, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. It's shown just in an abbreviated version. R here would be the other two carbons, so what is relevant here is just carbon number 1, okay? And when this sulfur attacks here, the electrons, these electrons will move over here and we form this kind of structure which is appropriately called thiohemiacetal intermediate. Why do we call this a thiohemiacetal intermediate? Tell me. We lost a day of lecture, so.
That's because it's similar to a hemiacetal, but instead of an oxygen, it's a separate.
Exactly. Okay. So what would be a hemiacetal? Can you tell us?
Instead of a sulfur, we have an oxygen.
How would you form a hemiacetal?
An alcohol with an aldehyde.
Exactly. Okay. So alcohol and aldehyde would form a hemiacetal. Here we do not have an alcohol and OH. We have a thiol SH, and therefore we. So at this point we haven't had an oxidation of the substrate yet. This is going to happen next when hydride ion, an H minus, pretty much a proton with 2 electrons, that's how you can think of it, is abstracted from our substrate and transferred to nicotine amide adenine dinucleotide, the oxidized form of it, to reduce it to NADH. So this is a redox reaction going from here to there. NADH will then be released and be replaced in the active site by another molecule of NAD+, so that in the next round we can perform this oxidation reaction again. But what we have converted our substrate in, or intermediate, is an acyl thioester intermediate. So similarly to our nomenclature before, why can we call it an acyl thioester? It's so easy, I know.
Yeah, because it's in the sulfur instead of oxygen for an ester bond.
So how would we form an ester?
And alcohol and the carboxylic acid.
Alcohol and carboxylic acid. Here we don't have the alcohol. We had an SH, okay, that originally attacked the carbon, therefore it's a thioester, okay? So after replacing the NADH with an NAD+, we do not simply hydrolyze this thioester bond because this would not yield anything from an energetic point of view, okay? But what happens is that the bond between the carbon and the sulfur is actually cleaved by, do I have this somewhere? Phosphorylasis, pretty much a lysis utilizing phosphor or phosphate. So the phosphorus, or the phosphate actually, the oxygen attacks here, the nucleophilic attack this carbon. We form the mixed anhydride, okay, cleave the bond to the sulfur, and regenerate our active site so that we can continue with this kind of reaction over and over, okay? So, classic textbook mechanism. So let's take a look at nicotine amide adenine dinucleotide, very important cofactor in reactions like this, redox reactions. Widely used by quite a number of oxidoreductases that are referred to as dehydrogenases. We are talking about, as the name implies, a dinucleotide. So I told you previously what a nucleotide is. It comprises a nitrogenous base, a sugar, and a phosphate. Here we have a dinucleotide, so we have to look for 2 nitrogenous bases, 2 sugars, and 2 phosphates. So if we start here, we pretty much only have down here an adenosine monophosphate pretty much, okay? We have an adenine linked to a ribose, linked to a phosphate. But the phosphate now is linked to another phosphate, linked to another ribose, and another nitrogenous basis, which is nicotine amide, okay? Derivative of vitamin B3, niacin. And here the redox action actually takes place. So what we're looking at here on the left side is the oxidized form, which we can refer to as NAD+. Now be warned, the plus does not refer to an overall charge of the molecule, which would actually be negative. It refers to positive charge that the nitrogen has here in the oxidized form of this nicotine amide ring, okay? So what can happen to this ring system is that a hydride ion, an H- ring, okay, to reduce this ring system and form NADH, that's what we call it. So this is a transfer of electrons, so we transfer 1 hydrogen in the form of a proton, you could think, and 2 electrons, so we have an uptake of electrons, which is a reduction, as you may remember. Now the dehydrogenases that utilizes NAD+/NADH are stereoselective and accept a hydride or donate a hydride only from either side of the planar ring system. Can be the upper side or the lower side. And the nomenclature is such that we can refer to the upper face or side of this planar ring system as the A side or Re side, RE, okay? And the lower side, lower face, as the B side or CSI face, okay? So certain dehydrogenases will transfer a hydride to the upper face, others to the lower face. This can be tested with deuterium transfer, okay, where you can distinguish the deuterium from the hydrogen on the other side. And this is a classic example of enzyme stereoselectivity, one, again, textbook example. Now, since, and that's something we discussed previously in the context of bioenergetics in our redox discussion, since the transfer of electrons in biochemistry often occurs as a transfer of hydrogen, okay? Remember, hydrogenation, reduction, dehydrogenation, oxidation. Usually, when we have such redox reactions where NAD+/NADH participates, we, let's say, take away, from a stoichiometric point, molecular hydrogen from a substrate, okay? And in such a case, we take away 2, you can think of it, 2 protons and 2 electrons. But what is transferred to NAD+ is only 1 hydrogen, 1 H+, and 2 electrons, and the other proton is released into the environment. And for that reason, whenever you formulate such redox reactions where NAD+ participates, you want to actually indicate this by saying, okay, What is produced from NAD plus in our redox reaction is NADH plus H plus. Okay, some biochemists consider this important, like my former teachers. Okay, so just that you know that that's where this H plus comes from. Now this is also a reversible reaction. This arrow pointing only from left to right is a little misleading because we can of course also transfer the hydride back to appropriate substrate and oxidize NADH back to NAD+. Now, there is a sister compound of NAD+ / NADH, which is a phosphate, where we find a phosphate here in this position of pretty much our AMP portion of NAD+ or NADH, and we produce NADP+ or NADPH reduced form. So nicotine phosphate. Now, with regard to the redox activity, they are the same. Okay. Some enzymes utilize NAD+ / NADH, and others utilize NAD+ / NADPH. Now, as a general, very, very general rule of thumb, you can assume that in biosynthetic anabolic reactions, often enough, we will have participation of NADPH, NADP+, let's say, that is produced usually. While in catabolic reactions, we typically see participation of NAD+ / NADH. Okay, but it's a matter of taste also, what you consider then catabolic or anabolic. But that's a general rule of thumb. Okay? Now, what is important and interesting about reduced and the oxidized form of these cofactors is that they differ with regard to their spectral properties, and in particular, as you can see from the spectra here, in the UV range of about 200 to 400 nanometers, the reduced form NADH, this is true also for NADPH, has an additional absorbance maximum at around 340 nanometers. So we do not have any significant absorbance in the oxidized state of the cofactor, but we have quite significant absorbance actually in the reduced state. So this may not sound like a big deal to you, but this actually is the foundation of one of the most important tools in enzyme kinetics and let's say related disciplines, where you want to follow biochemical reactions and determine the rates of biochemical reactions, because if you can measure a change in the absorbance, it allows you to easily follow the production of a molecule or the consumption of a molecule. Okay, so all you would have to do is that you perform your reaction in a cuvette and put it into a spectrophotometer and set it to 340 nanometers, and you follow the change in the absorbance at 340 nanometers. And I have included an example here where ethanol is converted into acetaldehyde. So this is actually an oxidation of the alcohol to an aldehyde. Can be catalyzed by alcohol dehydrogenase. We are going to talk about this enzyme possibly later today. And the cofactor that is utilized by this enzyme is also NAD+, which is reduced to NADH. So if you just, let's say, put everything in the cuvette and then add the substrate or add the enzyme, you will see that your absorbance actually will increase until all the substrate is utilized actually, and you will have pretty much linear increase typically over the initial phase of this reaction, which allows you to determine the rate, because using the extinction coefficient of NADH, you can actually calculate the amount per volume, actually the concentration change of NADH that is formed in a period of time, that allows you to determine the rate of the enzymatic reaction. Okay? And similarly, if you had a consumption of NADH, you would just see a decrease starting point. Okay, so this has become or has been one of the most important tools in enzyme kinetics. And even if you do not have a reaction that immediately produces or consumes NADH, often enough, as an enzyme kineticist, you will couple the reaction of interest to another one that does consume or produce NADH, so that you can actually then make deductions of what happened in your reaction of interest. Okay. So, very important, and the wavelengths that you may want to remember that is being used here is 340 nanometers. Okay. So, when NADH is produced, we get increase in 340 nanometers. If it's consumed, we get decrease in 340 nanometers. And you cannot overestimate the importance of this. You may remember that originally I told you that glycolysis is also one of the pathways that is typically discussed first, because many of the biochemical techniques that are still in use have been established studying this pathway. So this is just another depiction of the glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase reaction. I think in the newer edition of the textbook there's yet another picture, but they all show the same thing. So we have produced now in the 6th step of glycolysis an energy-rich mixed anhydride. And the energy of this mixed anhydride is utilized in the 7th reaction to produce ATP. So we have entered previously the payoff phase. Remember what this pathway is about. It's about energy production. We had to invest 2 molecules of ATP for each molecule of glucose that is degraded in the preparatory phase. Now here we actually get ATP. Now what you have to consider also as an energy-rich molecule that has been produced already in the glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase reaction is the NADH that we produce. But as previously pointed out, this NADH will only be utilized for further ATP production under aerobic conditions, not under anaerobic conditions. Okay? So if we just look at pure production of ATP, so here we have the first production of ATP. Remember also that 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate entered the payoff phase. So from step 6 on, the previous one, we have to multiply everything by 2. So per molecule of glucose that is broken down in glycolysis, we produce, even at this step already, 2 molecules of ATP. Okay. So what happens is that we transfer this phosphate obviously to adenosine diphosphate to produce ATP. The energetics shown here are a little misleading. Okay, under standard transformed conditions, it looks like it's quite hexagonic. In reality, it isn't. Also because this step is closely coupled to the previous one, and then together they are closer to 0. The enzyme is called phosphoglycerate kinase, and we discussed previously what kinases do. Do you remember? What does a kinase do?
Phosphorylates a protein.
Not necessarily only protein. Kinases phosphorylate stuff consuming ATP. Okay? So obviously this enzyme which catalyzes a reversible reaction is named for the reverse reaction, okay, for the phosphorylation of 3-phosphoglycerate, which is produced here in glycolysis, utilizing ATP to form 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate and ADP. So we have a transfer looking at glycolysis of this phosphate to ATP, produce 3-phosphoglycerate, ATP is and ATP. The enzyme kinase looks very similar to hexokinase. It's also bilobed, also undergoes rather significant induced fit. And despite the fact that they look similar, they're not really related, these 2 enzymes, okay? So, the next step then is an isomerization reaction where the 3-phosphoglycerate, so we have the phosphate obviously at carbon number 3, is transferred to, it seems like, it's transferred to carbon number 2 to form 2-phosphoglycerate. Maybe I should mention a little bit the nomenclature here. You have to familiarize yourself with the nomenclature. Okay? So we are talking about a 3-phosphoglycerate, because glycerate 8 here indicates that we're dealing with the ionized form of an acid. So the acid would be glyceric acid, but it's ionized and therefore refer to the parent compound, what we're looking at here as glycerate. Now it is phosphorylated at carbon number 3, and therefore we call it a 3-phosphoglycerate. Okay? So if you know these basic terms and this basic nomenclature, relating the names to the structure really should be a piece of cake for you guys. Okay, so familiarize yourself. You have doubt? You doubting that?
No.
No? I mean, glycerol, glyceraldehyde, glycerate. I mean, that's what we're dealing with so far. Come on. So the enzyme is not called phosphoglycerate isomerase simply, but it's called phosphoglycerate mutase, and mutase indicates that we are dealing with an intramolecular group transfer. So there are enzymes that catalyze transfer of one functional group from one position to another position in a molecule, and they often enough are called mutases. Okay? Again, a readily reversible reaction. Now, the fact that this enzyme catalyzes an intramolecular group transfer is therefore called a mutase, and the fact that it looks like this phosphate is transferred simply here from carbon 3 to carbon number 2 is quite misleading, because that's actually not what happens. To keep things interesting, something else happens, which is shown in the next slide. Namely, a transfer of a phosphate first from our enzymes, the mutase, to carbon number 2 in the 3-phosphoglycerate to produce a bisphosphorylated intermediate, a 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. So then the enzyme that first donates from a phosphorylated histidine a phosphate to carbon number 2 takes away the phosphate at carbon number 3, so that we are left with 2-phosphoglycerate and have regenerated phosphorylated histidine residue on the active site. Okay, so it's, I give you one, but I take one away from you. It's not like, take this one and move it over. It's, okay, I add one here and I take the other one away. We will see the same kind of intramolecular group transfer again when we talk about the isomerization of glucose 6-phosphate and glucose 1-phosphate. There we will also be dealing with an active site that has a phosphorylated amino acid residue, but in that case the phosphate will actually be found at a serine residue. Now here it's found at a histidine residue. And the question is, okay, where does this phosphate come from originally? So there is a kinase actually that can form from 3-phosphoglycerate a 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate, and we can utilize one of these phosphates to originally phosphorylate this histidine residue. So the question originally may have been, okay, what was first, the hen or the egg? Okay, so here it's a little different because we actually have another player coming in who phosphorylates the histidine residue on the active site originally. Now, 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate may be a compound that you are quite familiar with in a different context. Do you remember where you may have heard about 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate before?
Hemoglobin? Yeah, hemoglobin?
Hemoglobin, exactly. And what role did 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate play in hemoglobin? Do you remember? Do you remember?
Yeah, I know, like, it has higher affinity for hemoglobin at elevated areas, I guess. And it decreases O2 affinity.
No, not quite. You mean the right thing. So 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate is an important effector of hemoglobin affinity towards oxygen. And 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate actually binds to hemoglobin and stabilizes the so-called T state, which is a low affinity state. So not the high affinity, so it makes it actually less affinity. And this is one of the contributors lowering the overall affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen which enables hemoglobin then to release oxygen in tissues, because otherwise it would just hold on to oxygen in tissues and would not let go of the places where it should or has to deliver oxygen to. So other factors are, for example, primarily the protonation of certain amino acid residues, or the Bohr effect, if you've heard about this. And then the concentration of 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate actually may change depending on altitude, and is higher at higher altitudes to make it even easier to release oxygen in tissues. Because you have less oxygen, you shouldn't hold on too much. So the concentrations of 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate are particularly high in erythrocytes for that reason, but we also find 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate in other tissues. Okay, here we see that 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate is kind of an intermediate here in this mutase reaction. So the 2-phosphoglycerate that are dehydrated, meaning, okay, dehydration, meaning we take away a water molecule. And the water molecule in biochemistry is most typically taken away by removing a proton from one carbon and a hydroxide ion from an adjacent carbon. Okay? And this is actually happening here in this reaction, which is catalyzed by enolase. So the hydroxide, so shown as a hydroxyl here, and the proton shown as a hydrogen here, shown in red boxes, actually are removed. So H plus and OH minus gives H2O. Okay, we release water, and we have introduced a double bond here in this molecule, in the 3-carbon molecule, which is called phosphoenol pyruvate. Talked about the nomenclature of this molecule previously in different contexts, in context of energetics. Here, why is it called phosphoenol pyruvate? Because the parent compound here of the phosphate would be an enol form of pyruvate. Okay, we've seen this before. It would have a hydroxyl group here. Now this hydroxyl has been phosphorylated, so what kind of functional group are we dealing with here? You say it. You say it.
I don't want to say it.
You say it. Tell me. Come on. What do you think it is?
Because it's not a mixed anhydride.
No.
So it's a
It's a?
phosphoester.
Yeah. Okay, it's a phosphoester. Bingo. Okay. So we have a phosphoenol, okay, ene because we have a double bond here, and ol because we have underlying here a hydroxyl group, okay. Now phosphoenol pyruvate, let me talk about this enzyme interestingly. This enzyme is classified as a lyase. You may remember the classes of enzymes, okay. 6 classes. This is a lyase. So the first number here, our enzyme commission number, has to be a 4, because this enzyme catalyzes group elimination to form a double bond. That's what is happening. Okay, so I want you to keep this in mind, because we will see this again when we talk about, I think, the citric acid cycle for another enzyme, where your first guess would probably be that this is classified as an isomerase, but then it's actually classified as a lyase. Now here it's relatively easy to see that this is a lyase. Okay, so phosphoenol pyruvate. Let's take a look at the reaction first. We have appropriate amino acid residues that take away the proton and the hydroxide ion. So lysine residue here takes away a proton, gets protonated. And the glutamate on the other side takes away the hydroxide. Now, typically, when a hydroxide is removed, often enough we have participation of glutamate residues and the glutamic acid, I should say, the protonated form, which donates or makes available a proton to protonate the hydroxide to form a water molecule. This supposedly makes it easier to get the hydroxide removed, so to facilitate the water production. Okay. But from a stoichiometric point of view, we deprotonate here and we remove a hydroxide here, and then form this phosphoenol pyruvate. I would like to remind you that phosphoenol pyruvate is a high energy compound. And in biochemistry, often enough, we call it a super high energy compound. Okay, so we need 30.5 kilojoules per mole to produce ATP. Here in this list, which we've seen previously, we see that glycolysis actually produces two such molecules, one being 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. We've seen how the energy in this mixed anhydride is used for ATP production already. And now we have produced another high energy compound, a super high energy compound, phosphoenol pyruvate. And the energy stored then in this molecule is used in the 10th step of glycolysis to produce another molecule of ATP. So this reaction actually, under physiological conditions, is exergonic, it's irreversible. It's our third irreversible step in glycolysis, following the hexokinase reaction and the phosphofructokinase 1 reaction. It's also subject to regulation, which we're going to discuss either later today or next time. So the enzyme, nevertheless, is named for the reverse reaction. It's called pyruvate kinase, pretty much named for the phosphorylation of pyruvate to form phosphoenol pyruvate. I think under experimental conditions you can actually achieve this. We previously, let's just look at it again. I'm not quite sure if you've seen this. So there's participation of cations in the form of magnesium and potassium cations. They're complex or substrate. We have a transfer of the phosphoryl group here from phosphoenol pyruvate to ADP to produce ATP. And then we first form the enol form of pyruvate, which then is converted to the keto form of pyruvate in this tautomerization reaction that we discussed previously, which actually yields the majority of the overall energetic yield in this reaction, about 46 kilojoules per mole, which transfers here the enol form to a keto form, which is more stable. So if we look at the breakdown of the energetics of this reaction, the pyruvate kinase reaction, the hydrolysis of this phosphoester bond of phosphoenol pyruvate would not yield enough energy to couple it to ATP production, because this bond, this phosphoester bond, is worth about 16 kilojoules per mole. But then we have this tautomerization, which provides another 46 kilojoules per mole. And overall, our change in free energy for this reaction, the phosphoenol pyruvate is converted to the keto form of pyruvate, yields about 62 kilojoules per mole, more than we need to produce ATP. Let's take a look at the net reaction of glycolysis. So we have a 6-carbon sugar, glucose, being converted into 2 molecules of pyruvate. Okay, 2 3-carbon molecules. In the process, we actually produce, as a net result, 2 molecules of ATP. So we just saw that we have 2 reactions in the payoff phase, the phosphoglycerate kinase and the pyruvate kinase reactions, that produce, per glucose molecule that is degraded, 2 molecules of ATP each. So the production in the payoff phase is 4 molecules of ATP, but then we had to invest 2 molecules of ATP in the preparatory phase, and for that reason the net result with regard to ATP production is 2 molecules of ATP, okay, which are worth about 61 kilojoules per mole. If you think about the energetic content of glucose, which is 2,840 kilojoules per mole, if you completely burn it, you can calculate what the efficiency is, okay, somewhere in the range of 2% or so. Not great. Told you under aerobic conditions, also the NADH that is produced in the 6th step of glycolysis in the glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase reaction can be utilized. It's coupled to cellular respiration, to electron transfer and oxidative phosphorylation. But under anaerobic conditions, the net result, or net energetic yield with regard to ATP production, is 2 molecules of ATP. So only about 40% actually of the overall change in free energy of this glycolytic pathway is utilized for ATP production, and 60% or so are just used to drive this overall pathway from the degradation from glucose to the production of pyruvate. Okay, so I indicated that there's a distinction between aerobic conditions and anaerobic conditions. So we will spend quite a bit of time, starting maybe next week, maybe starting Thursday, to talk about what happens under aerobic conditions. And I think in a little while we'll talk about what happens under anaerobic conditions. But for the time being, we will other sugars that can actually be channeled into glycolysis. So glycolysis is usually formulated looking at the degradation of glucose, making us assume that only glucose can be utilized for glycolysis. This is an oversimplification, because as you can see here, quite a variety of other carbohydrates can also be utilized for energy production glycolysis, so they are channeled into the glycolytic pathway one way or the other. So we'll pretty much talk about all of these sugars that you see here, ranging from polymers, glycogen and starch being the most important one, disaccharides that then provide monosaccharides which can enter the glycolytic pathway at one point or another. So what we're going to start with is a discussion of how glycogen is broken down. So glycogen, as you know, is the storage form of carbohydrates. In our own body, we store it in the liver and in muscle tissue. Okay, the liver is important for homeostasis of glucose in our body and can consume or produce sugar and release sugar. Okay, so liver can consume for energy production sugars or carbohydrates or let's say glucose in glycolysis if there is sufficient sugar that we've taken up with our diet. But then if we run low, or if we're in danger of running low in sugar and are in danger of let's say reaching levels below 4 or 5 millimolar in our blood, then the sugar will actually break down glycogen, the storage form of glucose, and release it to tissues, and then at one point also start to synthesize glucose in gluconeogenesis. Okay. Muscle tissue does not release glucose into the bloodstream, but can utilize glycogen that is stored in muscle tissue for energy production in muscle. So the couple of 100 grams or so that we may have in our muscle tissue doesn't really help other tissues that depend on glucose as energy source, like erythrocytes. So that's where the liver is crucially important. So how do we break down glycogen? Remember, we have alpha 1 to 4 glycosidic chains and branching points every 8 to 12 residues, where we have alpha 1 to 6 bonds. Okay, and there are these two different types of enzymes that are required to break down glycogen. One is called glycogen phosphorylase, and it cleaves these alpha 1 to 4 glycosidic bonds and produces glucose 1-phosphate. So what this is another form of phosphorylasis. Okay, it's not a hydrolysis of these glycosidic bonds between the terminal sugar in an alpha 1 to 4 glycosidic chain and the one before it, but it's a phosphorylasis, meaning the glycogen phosphorylase, as the name implies, a phosphorylase, utilizes phosphate to break this bond. So this breakdown of these alpha 1 to 4 chain happens at the so-called non-reducing end. Remember the terminology used here that indicates directionality in our sugar polymers. Here we are dealing with the non-reducing end. We do not have a hemiacetal here anymore, okay? So we cannot open up this ring. We could do this at the other side, hypothetically, okay? So, what happens is we cleave this bond, bring in phosphate, and form a glucose 1-phosphate and a chain that is shortened by one residue. Okay? The glucose 1-phosphate is not a direct intermediate of glycolysis, but it can be converted, as I previously indicated, in isomerization reaction to glucose 6-phosphate with the help of a mutase, which is called phosphoglucomutase. And as I said before, when we talked about the other mutase, phosphoglycerate mutase, this mutase actually utilizes a serine residue that can be phosphorylated, not a histidine residue. Now, what is relevant here for our discussion of glycogen breakdown is the conversion of glucose 1-phosphate to glucose 6-phosphate, but of course this is a reversible reaction. So what would happen is that the enzyme in its phosphorylated state would donate a phosphate to the glucose carbon number 6 to form a glucose 1,6-bisphosphate, and then take away the phosphate from carbon number 1 to produce glucose 6-phosphate. Okay? Similar to the other mutase reaction that we discussed, where we went through 2,3-bisphosphoglycerate. Here we go through a glucose 1,6-bisphosphate. Okay, what I also have to discuss then is what happens to these alpha-1 to 6 glycosidic bonds. To break up these bonds, we have to actually use another enzyme. Now, what is interesting about the glycogen phosphorylase is that it can work on alpha-1 to 4 glycosidic bonds only up to 4 residues away from a branching point in glycogen. So this is indicated here by these yellow and the red residues. So glycogen phosphate can cleave off glucose residues and form glucose 1-phosphate, which can be isomerized to glucose 6-phosphate, but then it cannot proceed once it has reached a point 4 units away from a branching point. Here, another enzyme actually is important, which is conveniently enough called debranching enzyme. Okay, what it does, it debranches glycogen because it transfers then 3 of these 4 residues at the branching site, the branching point, to an alpha-1 to 4 chain, extends it, and glycogen phosphorylase can continue chopping up these residues. And then the same enzyme, the same debranching enzyme, actually also has a glucosidase, or glucosidase, you can say that also, activity to cleave off this residue that is shown in red here, which linked to the alpha-1 to 4 chain via an alpha-1 to 6 bond in the form of a glucose. Okay, and then we just have an unbranched alpha-1 to 4 glycosidically linked polymer, which can be chopped up further by glycogen phosphorylase. So we need glycogen phosphorylase, and we need this debranching enzyme, which actually has 2 activities, this transferase activity and the glucosidase or glucosidase activity. Okay. So, now let's move on to the other polymer. You don't see this really here immediately, which is probably for most humans, the most important source of carbohydrates in our diet, namely starch. Okay, so starch, remember, comprises amylopectin, where we only have alpha-1 to 4 glycosidically linked glucose molecules in a polymer, and amylopectin, which looks like glycogen pretty much, but doesn't have quite as many branching points, only every 24 to 32 residues. The degradation of starch, as you may know, starts in your mouth, where we have secretion of alpha amylase. Alpha amylase cleaves bonds within our starch molecules and produces smaller fragments. And there are also fragments that contain branching points, and these fragments are called dextrins. Okay. Now, then your food content actually enters the stomach, where not a whole lot happens to your carbohydrates, but carbohydrate digestion then continues in your small intestine, where we also have secretion of alpha amylase. And alpha amylase further chops up your starch into fragments that have been produced. And dextrinase also breaks down. We produce in this process also this disaccharide maltose, which is comprised of 2 sugar residues in the form of glucose, linked by alpha 1 to 4 glycosidic bonds. We saw the structure before when I gave you this review, okay? And this disaccharide, just like other dietary disaccharides that you typically take up with your food, namely lactose, sucrose, and trehalose, are broken down to the monomeric building blocks by a class of enzymes called disaccharidases. Okay? And depending on the activity, getting frustrated here?
Yeah, my nose.
Oh, your nose, I thought the terminology is confusing you. Okay. Depending on the substrate of these disaccharidases, we can distinguish between the enzymes maltase, lactase, sucrase, and trehalase. Okay? And they cleave these disaccharides into the monomeric building blocks, which are 2 molecules of glucose from maltose, a molecule of galactose and a molecule of glucose for lactose, fructose and glucose for sucrose, and 2 molecules of glucose for trehalose. Okay. Now, what is interesting about these disaccharidases is that they are actually found in the so-called intestinal brush border. So you may or may not know what your small intestine looks like. It's highly folded to increase the surface area. And we have these protrusions here, which are called intestinal villi. So we have by epithelial cells, and in these villi we find lymphatic vessels and also blood vessels, okay? And so we have these finger-like protrusions at the macroscopic scale to increase the surface area, but at the microscopic scale, each of these epithelial cells has finger-like protrusions actually at this so-called apical surface, which faces the intestinal lumen. If you look at this slide again, this is stained here in blue. Okay, these are individual epithelial cells. You see the nuclei here, and then this would be the intestinal brush border here. Okay, here's a cross section where we have the microscopic level finger-like protrusions going into the intestinal lumen. This also serves to increase the surface area here of your intestine. Now it's here, pretty much in this intestinal brush border, where we have these disaccharidases located, and monosaccharides which stem from uptake of dietary sugars in the form of polymeric or oligomeric sugars being produced. Now the sugars then have to reach our bloodstream, one way or the other, and how this happens is shown using glucose as an example. Glucose is transported, a couple of transporters for these carbohydrates. Okay? And glucose, also galactose if not mistaken, can be taken up by a transporter that transports glucose in symports together with sodium. Okay? And these type of transporters, symporters are very important here for the uptake of carbohydrates. So glucose is taken up in symport with sodium and enters the cell. So in order to have this symport with sodium happen, we have to have and retain our concentration gradient between extracellular concentration of sodium and the intracellular concentration of sodium. And you may know, and I hope you do, that there is actually ATPase, sodium-potassium ATPase, which consumes ATP to actually transport sodium ions, 3 sodium ions, from inside the cell to the outside of a cell, and at the same time transport 2 potassium ions from outside of a cell into the inside of a cell. What this then achieves is that we have a huge concentration gradient between the inside of cells and the outside of cells with regard to potassium and sodium, which is very important for a variety of reasons. Okay? And this is actually achieved under ATP production. That's why we call it ATPase. So this is actually a secondary active transport because it depends on an active transport, active meaning that it utilizes energy in the form of ATP. So glucose now is in the cell for the time being and is transported to the bloodstream on the other side, on the basal surface of these epithelial cells, pretty much based on the concentration gradient and by a glucose uniporter. Now in this case, it's primarily GLUT2. There are different glucose transporters depending on different tissues. And this is a facilitated downhill efflux, meaning, okay, it's driven by concentration differences. Okay, so this is not an active transport, it's a passive transport. Here I added a couple of numbers just to remind you, if you haven't heard this, of the concentration differences between the outside of a cell and the inside of a cell with regard to sodium and potassium. So we have on the outside of a cell about 145 millimolar sodium concentrations, and intracellularly, okay, much less, 12 millimolar or something like this. It's the other way around, pretty much. If we look at potassium, where we have a much higher concentration inside the cell, 140 millimolar or so, and outside we only have 4 millimolar. Okay, so let's take a look at what happens to these other monomeric sugars other than glucose. We saw how glucose is broken down in glycolysis. So how can we utilize fructose? So here we have to distinguish between the liver and extrahepatic tissues. And usually when we talk about extrahepatic tissues, anything but the liver, okay, but usually in this context we think of tissues like muscle tissue, okay. Now if we look at extrahepatic tissues, it's relatively straightforward, because in extrahepatic tissues like muscle, we have hexokinase that can accept not only glucose as a substrate, but is more promiscuous and can also accept other monomeric sugars like fructose, and can easily phosphorylate it at carbon number 6 to produce fructose 6-phosphate, which is an intermediate of glycolysis, would also result from the isomerization of glucose 6-phosphate to fructose 6-phosphate. So we are in business. We can channel this fructose 6-phosphate directly into the glycolytic pathway, the rest of it. Okay. Now, if we are looking at the liver, the situation is a bit more complex, because the prevalent isozyme of hexokinases here is actually glucokinase, or hexokinase 4, which differs from muscle hexokinase for a variety of reasons. I indicated some before briefly. Now, here what is relevant is its substrate specificity, because it actually will not usually accept anything but glucose. And we have to take these statements always with a grain of salt, okay? But it really prefers glucose. It doesn't like fructose. So, doesn't mean that we cannot metabolize fructose in the liver. We just have to take a detour pretty much and utilize other enzymes that are found in the liver, namely a fructokinase, okay, that can phosphorylate fructose to fructose 1-phosphate, not fructose 6-phosphate, interesting enough, but fructose 1-phosphate. And the fructose 1-phosphate, here shown in the open chain form, can then be cleaved by an aldolase that can cleave fructose 1-phosphate. So remember, we talked about aldolase that can cleave fructose 1,6-bisphosphate to produce glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and dihydroxyacetone phosphate. Here we have an aldolase that cleaves fructose 1-phosphate. So it will produce, again, 2 3-carbon compounds, but only one of these will be phosphorylated, and it's dihydroxyacetone phosphate, which can be isomerized while triose phosphate isomerized to glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, and then we are in business. So this is relatively straightforward. However, the other 3-carbon unit is in glyceraldehyde, which first has to be phosphorylated with the help of an appropriate kinase called glyceraldehyde kinase to then be channeled to the glycolytic pathway. Now there's another way which is a bit more complex, where glyceraldehyde is first reduced to glycerol, is phosphorylated by a kinase to glycerol 3-phosphate, and then is oxidized back to dihydroxyacetone phosphate, which is then isomerized to glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So if you ask me if you had to find one way to do it, this is probably simple. Okay, but also the other way is possible. Now galactose is a special case because galactose cannot be easily phosphorylated to a galactose 6-phosphate and isomerized to glucose 6-phosphate or something like this. What happens here is summarized in something that was actually given its own pathway named Lillois pathway after a French scientist, if I'm not mistaken, Louis Lillois, who in the 1970s, early 1970s, 70 or 72, I can't remember, actually was awarded the Nobel Prize for this work. So the Lillois pathway shows us and tells us and explains to us how galactose can be actually channeled to the glycolytic pathway. And you see, it doesn't look too complicated, okay? What happens first is that galactose is phosphorylated carbon number 1 to form galactose 1-phosphate with the help of a kind of kinase called galactokinase utilizing ATP. Now, what seems to happen here, okay, now you have to pay attention, what seems to happen is that the galactose 1-phosphate is simply isomerized to glucose 1-phosphate. Remember, what's the difference between glucose and galactose? Structurally?
And then epimer at C4?
Epimer at C4, that's what I wanted to hear, exactly, thank you. Okay, so all we have to do really to convert our galactose 1-phosphate to glucose 1-phosphate would be to change the position of the hydroxyl group and the hydrogen here at carbon number 4, right, to flip them. Now, unfortunately, there is no enzyme that can do that directly with galactose 1-phosphate or glucose 1-phosphate. But there's an enzyme that can do that once these sugars are actually linked to UDP, okay, uridine diphosphate. So what happens is that this galactose 1-phosphate is uridylated by transferring pretty much a UDP or UMP, I should say, from UDP glucose to the galactose residue to form UDP galactose. Okay? In the same process, then, the UDP glucose or the sugar moiety in UDP glucose becomes a glucose 1-phosphate, which can be isomerized to glucose 6-phosphate, and we're in business again. But this doesn't mean that these carbons here in this sugar are the same as those. Okay? What we have achieved is we have replaced our sugars here pretty much, the galactose, with a glucose which came in here. Now our original galactose here is now in the form of a UDP galactose, and the UDP galactose is isomerized to UDP glucose. And the enzyme, because we're talking about epimers, is called UDP galactose 4 epimerase. Tongue twister. Okay. Now what is interesting about this enzyme also is that it has an NAD+ in the active side. And what happens here is that transiently, that this hydroxyl group is oxidized to a carbonyl, and then pretty much we have a reduction again, but in such a way that the hydroxyl group that was oxidized previously is found now in the other position. Okay, and that's the epimerization. Okay, understood? Good. So, mannose. Mannose is also accepted by extrahepatic hexokinases, okay, and can be converted to mannose 6-phosphate, and there's an isomerase which can convert mannose 6-phosphate to fructose 6-phosphate, interesting enough. Now, for the longest time, and your textbooks don't tell you that, okay? For the longest time, I was wondering what's happening to mannose in the liver, actually, and for years and years, every time I taught this, I remembered I wanted to look this up, and finally looked it up. I found it can also be phosphorylated in the liver by glucokinase to mannose 6-phosphate. Okay. Now, again, take this a little bit with a grain of salt, okay? Because usually what you hear is that glucokinase only accepts glucose. Now, it may also accept mannose, okay? But with regard to specificity, it's much more specific than the muscle hexokinase. Yes?
And you said this is specific in the liver?
The glucokinase we find predominantly in the liver. Okay, so in extrahepatic tissues, it's the other isozymes of hexokinase that can phosphorylate it anyway, okay, because it's not as specific as the hexokinase 4 glucokinase that we have in the liver. In textbooks, you will always hear, okay, glucokinase only phosphorylates glucose. But when I tried to find out what happens to mannose in the liver, because I thought, okay, something must have happened also in the liver to mannose, I found a paper that said, okay, can all. Okay? Okay, so let's at least start talking about regulation of glycolysis. I told you that there are 3 hexagonic steps, and I hope I made it clear that when we look for regulatory steps, we have to look at the energetics of reaction. If we just look at this table, we see that not only on the standard transformed condition, but also on the physiological conditions, we have a negative change in free energy for the first, the third, and the 10th step, so the hexokinase, phosphofructokinase 1, and the pyruvate kinase reaction. And these enzymes are also subject to regulation. Now, again, there are some general principles which I will share with you, which are certainly at work here in the regulation of glycolysis. What you find in textbooks, you should, and I repeat myself, take with a grain of salt, because a lot of this is outdated. It's very complex. It may not be completely understood anyway at this point. But I will try to highlight a couple of things that are pretty well understood. Okay? So, we have these 3 enzymes. What you have to understand is that these enzymes are expressed in different tissues, and different tissues also regulation may be different. Okay, that's a general rule that you should keep in mind. So not always assume that since this was characterized in this tissue, it may be exactly the same in different tissue. Often enough it is, but sometimes it's not. Okay, so that's the first. For hexokinase, and here I'm talking about extrahepatic hexokinase like we find in muscle, these hexokinases are subject to negative feedback regulation, to competitive inhibition by the product glucose 6-phosphate. So glucose 6-phosphate is structurally similar enough to glucose, so that if it accumulates, it can also bind to the active site and block the active site. So it's a classical competitive inhibition. I hope that Dr. Baker talked a little bit about the types of inhibition. I think I asked you that before, and I'm not sure. But competitive inhibition means, okay, the active site is occupied by a structurally analogous molecule. Okay? So for glucokinase, it's different. So glucokinase meaning the isozyme that we find predominantly in the liver. Okay. What happens is that the regulation of glucokinase is a bit more complex, and when there is not enough glucose for the liver to actually be able to consume glucose that is needed by other tissues for ATP production, the enzyme, especially from the cytoplasm where glycolysis takes place to the nucleus. It's pretty much taken out of the equation, and it binds to a glucokinase regulatory protein. Now, when the glucose concentration go up again, the enzyme actually, so we have dissociation between this regulatory protein and glucose, and our enzyme, not glucose, the hexokinase, sorry. And the enzyme actually moves back to the cytosol and then can be active again. Now, this process of translocation may also depend on other factors like fructose 1-phosphate, fructose 6-phosphate, and things like this. Okay, that's not really of great interest to us, but we have this transfer of glucokinase from the cytosol to the nucleus, which is quite interesting. Then also keep in mind that enzymes like insulin, glucagon may have a variety of effects on metabolism. Now here, the enzyme activity long term is also increased by raised insulin concentrations. Okay, so let's come to pyruvate kinase. So the last enzyme in glycolysis. And here, I just want to share with you a general concept, okay, because it's not, I think, 100% clear which molecule really activate it or inhibit, and it also depends on tissue, okay. But in general, when we look at catabolic reactions, catabolic pathways that are meant to produce energy, they are typically slowed down if we have an increasing concentration of molecules that indicate an energy sufficient state. Okay, so we shouldn't be surprised that a molecule like ATP may or will inhibit pyruvate kinase. Okay, if it accumulates, obviously we have enough ATP, we don't have to produce more ATP, we don't have to break down more glucose. Okay, so that makes sense. Other molecules that can have the same effect are, for example, fatty acids, which also indicate we have a lot of energy. There's more energy stored in fatty acids than in glucose. Okay, if we have lots of fatty acids, then often enough catabolic pathways are slowed down. The same is true, and we'll see this also for other enzymes, other examples, if we have an accumulation of acetyl-CoA. Okay, acetyl-CoA is an energy-rich compound which is produced in catabolic reactions. Acetyl-CoA is channeled into a citric acid cycle for more production of ATP. So if we have already a lot of acetyl-CoA, obviously we can slow down our catabolic pathway. On the other hand, if we have molecules, and I just want to point out this one, like AMP, adenosine monophosphate, or ADP, which are produced when ATP is broken down, we are obviously in an energy insufficient state because we are accumulating breakdown products of ATP, and we want to have more ATP. And such molecules typically have an activating effect on catabolic pathways. So if AMP or ADP accumulates, okay, we have to break down more molecules for energy production. Now, with regard to pyruvate kinase, there are a bunch of molecules that over the years have been identified as inhibitors and activators, respectively. ATP, for example, is an inhibitor, citrate is an inhibitor, maybe phosphoenol pyruvate. The most important modifier or modulator of the activity of phosphofructokinase 1 is fructose 2,6-bisphosphate. And fructose 2,6-bisphosphate is produced by an enzyme which is called phosphofructokinase 2. And I mentioned this before when we talked about glycolysis. There's a phosphofructokinase 1 which participates directly in glycolysis. There's a phosphofructokinase 2 which participates indirectly in glycolysis. Okay? Because it can phosphorylate fructose 6-phosphate to form fructose 2,6-bisphosphate. And fructose 2,6-bisphosphate, as it is produced, it increases in activity, will activate phosphofructokinase 1, the enzyme that participates directly in glycolysis. Okay? On the other hand, there's a phosphatase activity which can also cleave off this phosphate from carbon number 2 and regenerate fructose 6-phosphate, thus decreasing the concentration of this activator of phosphofructokinase 1. So the overall activity of phosphofructokinase 1 depends on the concentration of this molecule, fructose 2,6-bisphosphate, and with this the activity of either the kinase that produces fructose 2,6-bisphosphate or the phosphatase which breaks it down again. Okay. Now, what is interesting about these two, this is really interesting, okay, about these two activities is that they are located on the same enzyme, on the same protein, which we can refer to as tandem enzymes, with both on the same. Whether or not the phosphatase activity is active or the kinase activity is active depends on whether or not a serine residue in the enzyme, in this protein, is phosphorylated. Okay, and if we have a phosphorylated enzyme, then the phosphatase activity is on, and the kinase activity is down. And if we have a non-phosphorylated enzyme, the kinase activity is on, and the phosphatase activity is on. Now that's the last thing I'm going to discuss. This depends on the activity of the enzyme that would be able to phosphorylate this tandem enzyme, and it's protein kinase A, also called CAMP dependent protein kinase. And CAMP, as you may know, is an cellular second messenger, okay, which is produced in response to external stimuli, which can come in the form of hormonal stimuli, in the form of glucagon or epinephrine. Here we're talking about glucagon. Glucagon is secreted by the pancreas when your blood glucose concentration goes down. Glucagon is secreted. Glucagon will bind to appropriate receptors in the plasma membrane, will activate an enzyme called adenylyl cyclase, which cyclizes ATP to form cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP will increase in concentration, will activate protein kinase A. Protein kinase A will phosphorylate a bunch of target molecules, among others this tandem enzyme. In the phosphorylated state, then we will have actually a breakdown of fructose 2,6-bisphosphate to fructose 6-phosphate, and glycolysis will slow down in the liver. So this applies to the liver. Okay. And this is important because if glucagon is secreted, obviously our blood glucose concentration goes down, and now the primary role of the liver has to be to increase blood glucose concentration by no further breaking down glycolysis for energy production itself, but by starting gluconeogenesis and also breaking down glycogen. Okay? See you in the first.